This is the story of the founder of one of the most influential and famous financial companies in the world, J.P. Morgan Chase & Company. Regarded as the greatest banker in history by historians, John Pierpont Morgan was credited for financing and growing some of the most successful companies in American history, like Northern Securities and U.S. Steel. He was also the person to whom the U.S. government would turn to in times of economic stress. In this video, we'll see how former presidents like Teddy Roosevelt and Grover Cleveland depended on the financial juggernaut to save the U.S. economy from collapsing. To better understand what made him such a powerful figure that even the President of the United States was afraid of crossing him, let's take a look at J.P. Morgan's early life and career. J.P. Morgan was born on 17th April 1837 in Hartford, Connecticut, to a prominent family with a long history of involvement in the finance and banking industry. Morgan's father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was a successful merchant banker, and young John was exposed to the world of finance at an early age. He received a private education and later attended the University of Göttingen in Germany, where he pursued a degree in art and archaeology. When Pierpont was young, he was prone to frequent illnesses, constantly being bogged down with seizures and coughs. All of this was because of a condition called rheumatic fever. After assessing his son's condition, Julius Spencer Morgan sent him to the island of Azores, all alone, to help John toughen up mentally and recover from his illness. It worked wonders. Upon his return to the United States, Morgan began his career in finance, working for his father's firm, John Peabody & Co. He learned from his father and his circle of some of the most brilliant and intelligent people in the banking industry. His father and his friends are credited for financing the industrialization of America, which was still a developing nation in the 1800s. John quickly made a name for himself as a skilled financier, and in 1861 he established his own firm, J.P. Morgan & Co. He married Amelia, the love of his life, who was often known as Mimi. However, things took a turn for the worse when Amelia was diagnosed with tuberculosis and lost her life to the disease, all in spite of untiring efforts to save her. All of this happened within 4 months of their wedding, and it was too much to take for the young Morgan, and he was left heartbroken. John returned to New York, and what followed was the story of a man who dedicated his life to his work, a journey, a laurel that often felt like a love letter to his beloved late wife. J.P. Morgan's first major dealing with the government came during the American Civil War in 1861. In an incident which is now remembered as the Hall Carbine affair, Morgan was involved in financing the purchase of 5,000 junk rifles from the government at a price of 3.5 cents, restoring them for 75 cents, and then selling them for almost 7 times the original price when the Union was in a tough spot and had run out of weaponry after losing a key battle. This resulted in severe backlash from the government and media, to the extent that the Congressional Committee called John and his partners worse than traitors, who would go to any extent to fulfill their greed. Despite the scandal, Morgan was eventually cleared of any wrongdoings and continued to play a prominent role in changing the business landscape of America. But this goes to show that Morgan was a person who was always 2 steps ahead of the government, a trait which turned out to be pivotal in his future role as the savior of the U.S. economy. John was a genius when it came to identifying potential cash cows and making money out of them. One such genius move from Morgan was his investment in the railroad system, which was the backbone of the developing American economy. Between 1870 and 1910, also known as the Gilded Age, business and enterprise was reaching towering heights, and a lot of it was because of the creation of an incredible distribution network for goods via a robust network of railroads. Morgan was quick to identify the importance of this industry as the building blocks of the American economy, and left no stone unturned to skyrocket the growth of the railroads by using his connections, capital, and influence to facilitate its expansion. The Gilded Age saw monopolies emerging in popular industries, right from John D. Rockefeller's monopoly in the oil industry to Andrew Carnegie's U.S. Steel. But railroads were showcasing a different trend. there was a lot of competition, and often there were many companies who had rail lines beside one another on the same route. J.P. Morgan's business strategy was geared towards financing major companies, securing a place in their board through his investment, and then reshuffling the company's corporate structure to facilitate mergers and acquisitions. John used his financial expertise and connections to raise capital and acquire smaller railroads. He then combined these railroads into unified larger systems that were able to operate more efficiently and effectively. This process of consolidation allowed the railroads to achieve economies of scale, which helped them reduce costs and improve profits. His active role in the management of the companies he invested in later came to be known as Morganization, or what we call today activist investing. In addition to consolidation, Morgan also helped to modernize the railroads by investing in new technologies. He recognized that the railroads needed to be more efficient and reliable in order to compete with other forms of transportation, and he invested in new technologies such as steel rails and more powerful locomotives. He also encouraged the development of new techniques for managing and operating railroads, such as the use of standardized time schedules and the creation of centralized dispatching centers. J.P. Morgan made his name and fortune in the railroad industry, but soon the same industry was threatened by price wars between rival companies who were continuously cutting the prices to make sure that the customers chose them over their competitors who were operating on the same route. The margins had dropped so dramatically that one of the most important industries for the US economy saw almost 200 smaller railroad companies declaring bankruptcy in less than a year. This was a big cause of concern for the growing US economy, which heavily depended on this industry. The two major players in the railroad industry, the Pennsylvania Railroad Company and the New York Central, were at the center of this price war. The loss-leading strategy was doing no good to the railroad ecosystem and was single-handedly bringing down the margins for the industry overall. Investors who had put in around $1.5 billion on the railroads started to pull out more than $25 million every year. This was an alarming thing for the economy as a whole, because railroad companies accounted for more than 70% of the market capitalization of the publicly listed companies on the US stock exchange back then. This dark time in the US economy was known as the Great Depression. Someone had to step in and save the day. J.P. Morgan was known for his intimidating demeanor and dominating personality, standing at an impressive 6'2" with a big nose and an authoritative tone. He had a rare ability to dictate the terms in a negotiation. Morgan's honesty, combined with his influence over the railroad industry, had earned him the title of the Sheriff of the Wild West back in the day when there were no financial regulatory bodies in America. He invited the presidents of the two companies to join him on his luxury yacht, the Corsair, to discuss the terms of the new agreement, which would defuse the situation and save the American stock market from collapsing. Upon the arrival of both the presidents, Morgan was quick to express his concerns about the cutthroat competition and its impact on the financial sustainability of the railroad industry. He presented a new agreement which he considered fair for both parties, which would stop the price war and ensure both companies grew at a reasonable rate. But both Vanderbilt and Jay Gould were stubborn and refused to give in. However, J.P. Morgan had an ace up his sleeve. He refused to dock the ship until this matter was resolved. He also threatened to block access to further investor capital for their companies. The presidents of the companies were physically and mentally fatigued by Morgan's unconventional negotiation tactics and gave in to his terms. This landmark deal came to be known as the Corsair Pact. Morgan didn't step in just because he cared deeply for the railroad industry, but was incentivized by the US government because of the catastrophic impact the failure of railroads would have had on the economy of the country. He was awarded $100,000 in commission, as well as $1 million in profits through rail bonds. Just when it started to feel that the tough days for American markets were well behind, entered another challenge and another instance where the talismanic Morgan saved the day for the US economy. In the 1800s, the US dollar got its value by being tied with gold as a commodity, which meant that anyone holding high denominations of the US dollar could exchange it to get physical gold of the same value. The $100 and $50 bills were basically considered to be vouchers for gold, which could be easily redeemed at any time. To ensure people's trust in the financial system and the government, the US Treasury maintained $100 million worth of gold reserves at all times to fulfill these redemptions. However, the February of of 1893 brought in the much-feared chaos in the American economy, as gold reserves plunged way below the $100 million mark as people quickly started dumping their cash for gold. This made the European and British investors holding large amounts of cash uneasy, and they too started redeeming their cash, further depleting the US gold reserve and increasing panic in the market. This was the time where the integral corporations across the US looked up to the messiahs who had saved them time and again, the financiers of Wall Street. And there was no banker more powerful, influential, and skilled than John Pierpont Morgan. The US economy found its significance and strength in the gold reserves, and the moment that foundation started crumbling, it started meaning red flags for the Treasury. Morgan came up with a master plan to save the US economy and rushed to the White House to meet President Grover Cleveland. He had a plan which he thought would be the perfect solution to the government's problems. However, to his surprise, the plan was turned down. The government was relying on the sale of bonds to raise their gold reserves back to normal as a potential bailout from the situation. However, Morgan, who was known for his practicality among his peers, knew that the issuance of bonds would take time, a luxury the US government didn't have, with the fear of going bankrupt in just a couple of weeks. J.P. Morgan understood the gravity of the situation and rushed to Washington from New York to meet the president. After all, they were equally powerful and important to the country. If the president was the leader of the masses, Morgan ruled the world of finances. At first, the president didn't seem interested in meeting with him, but Morgan was adamant, refusing to go until he had explained his plan to the president in person. The next morning, he was ushered in to meet the president and his cabinet, who were not as much interested to meet the banker, even though he had time and again saved the American economy. But then there came the moment of redemption for Morgan, when the president received a call from the treasurer who informed Cleveland that the reserves had fallen to less than $9 million. The phone call sent shockwaves to everyone present there. Morgan went on to alert everyone in the room that he knows about a draft worth $12 million, which, if presented, would wipe out the complete US government's reserves within hours. Cleveland, now seemingly helpless, turned to Morgan for a solution. Morgan offered the government to buy the gold from his network of European investors who were ready to help the US government. He knew about an outdated law and loophole from the Civil War times that would allow him not just to sell gold directly to the US government, but also help them bypass Congress and avoid wasting any time along the way. Although the government working with the bankers of Wall Street received mixed responses, Cleveland signed the deal with Morgan and his group of investors, and within an hour, the situation was under control. Yes, the magic of the financial wizard had worked wonders once again. Morgan managed to bail out the government from another financial mishap. However, the move wasn't solely selfless, as Morgan also received a huge commission against the deal, which also led to people perceiving Morgan as an opportunist and a profiteer. After all, one man was running the country and influencing decision-making that was second to none. Soon after, Andrew Carnegie reached out to J.P. Morgan for selling the Carnegie Steel Company, which was already the biggest company in America, making well over $40 million a year. One expected a premium price tag for a complete takeover. Likewise, Carnegie, who wanted to retire and was done with the business world, wrote down the number on a piece of paper and sent it across to J.P. Morgan's office. Taking just one glance at the piece of paper with the numbers that read $480 million, J.P. Morgan agreed almost instantly, which became the largest business transaction in history until then, making Andrew Carnegie the richest person on the planet. Morgan merged the newly purchased Carnegie Steel Company with other steel companies that he had acquired to form the United States Steel Corporation, which was the first billion-dollar company in the world. Along with his steel monopoly, J.P. Morgan had also built himself a monopoly in the railroad industry through his company, Northern Securities. Northern Securities had acquired two of the market leaders from the railroad industry. This resulted in Morgan and his group of investors controlling more than 30% of all the rail lines in America. Morgan's power and influence almost made everyone feel that he was the king of America. However, while Morgan was consolidating his hold over the US economy, a new president was elected to power, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a strong leader who wasn't afraid to go up against the mega corporations that basically ruled the country. He introduced the Sherman Antitrust Act to attack monopolies and break them up so as to check the power these corporations wielded over the country and its economy. Morgan's Northern Securities and U.S. Steel, along with Rockefeller's Standard Oil and the tobacco monopoly American Tobacco, were high on Roosevelt's hit list. He was a tough man who couldn't be won over with bribery or fancy gifts, and Morgan knew it very well. Without informing the cabinet, Roosevelt openly declared that Northern Securities was being investigated for violating the antitrust laws under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Hearing this, Morgan again rushed to the White House to discuss with the president on how they can peacefully defuse the situation. However, things didn't work out as expected, and the Northern Securities Railroad Company was further split up in 1904. Despite the contrasting views, Roosevelt knew that Morgan was a nobleman with an uncanny ability to single-handedly save the economy when required. This allowed Roosevelt to swallow his pride and turn to Morgan for help when the U.S. stock market crashed in 1907. In 1907, the United Copper Company, which was a pivotal company for the mining sector, went bankrupt. This spelled disaster for the stock market as it single-handedly brought down 2 brokerage houses and 1 bank with it. The stock market reacted to the news of the struggling mining industry and closing of the major financial institutions with panic, and people started cashing in their stocks to safeguard their investments in the stock market. President Roosevelt was watching all of it from close quarters. He knew that only one man could save the American economy at this point. Roosevelt gave $25 million of government funds to Morgan and allowed him to use it in any way he saw fit in order to help resurrect the crashing stock market. Morgan urged leading bankers and businessmen to meet in his library to find a solution to the crisis at hand. As the bankers negotiated amongst themselves, J.P. Morgan laid down a plan where the leading bankers and big corporations would reinvest their money in the stock market in order to give it a small upward push. This would surely help pacify the panicking retail investors and give them confidence not to pull out any money from the market. On the very next day, it was reported that the crisis had started to fade away as the leading corporations were putting in more money to keep banks and public companies afloat. Once again, Morgan was the central figure orchestrating another bailout. However, this was also the last time America's financial fate was vested in the hands of a single person. In 1912, the Pujo Committee, which was a Senate-led group, started investigating a handful of all-powerful bankers of Wall Street who held considerable power, money, and control over the stock markets, as well as the American economy. It was evident from the investigation that J.P. Morgan was their key target. The investigation revealed that Morgan controlled more than $20 billion of capital through his role in more than 100 companies and his position as a board member in more than 300 companies. Despite investigations and tough interrogation from the committee, Morgan was found to be innocent, which was also a testament to his impeccable diplomatic skills. The Pujo Committee's ruling, though, became instrumental in the creation of the Federal Reserve System, a major milestone for the American economy. Despite the distress that the Pujo Committee caused to J.P. Morgan, he showed great signs of patriotism as he helped the government design the Federal Reserve System, a feat that speaks volumes about the great financier's character. He wanted to make sure that after his demise, there should be a strong, controlling and governing body who would fulfill the Herculean task of saving the U.S. economy in crisis, something J.P. Morgan had become famous for doing over the past 3 to 4 decades. The Pujo Committee and its proceedings, though, had a catastrophic impact on Morgan's health, as it was too much to take for the old man, who was already down with frequent illnesses. The sinking of the Titanic, which was one of J.P. Morgan's prized investments, also added to the mental agony. He passed away on March 31st, 1913, in a hotel room while traveling in Rome. Such was his impact on America's economy and Wall Street that the New York Stock Exchange remained closed for 2 hours till noon, whereas the flags on Wall Street were hoisted at half-mast. After all, America was bidding goodbye to one of its biggest saviors and the greatest banker who helped finance the growth of the U.S. economy when it was still a developing economy. Check this video we recently made, and please subscribe to Business Absolute for more entertaining business stories.